So I was thinking that we might look at Schreber a little bit. Who all is familiar with the case of Schreber? Or not, rather, who's not familiar with the case of Schreber? Okay. I'm going to say a little bit about the case, if I may. I'm going to spend a little time introducing it. Also because I think it's one of the most important texts. In other words, it's not so much a case as Daniel Paul Schreber wrote the memoirs of his nervous illness here around 1900. And that's what Freud then interpreted. Many people interpreted it. It's really not a single important psychoanalyst, but also a psychiatrist, and also various sorts of thinkers that are harder to identify, like Canetti, but also Benjamin, for whom the memoirs of my nervous illness by Schreber didn't prove to be fundamental. And there's some series of books being put out in New York now. I don't know, is it by the New York Review of Books or something? It's a series that's meant to outlast time itself, a permanent library. And they included, I couldn't believe it, a translation of the Schreber book. So we have no excuses not to have read it. It's really fabulous. The German title is somewhat different. It's Denkwürdigkeiten eines Nervenkranken, which means it's hard to translate, obviously. Thoughts that are worthy of further thought, or it also means strange thoughts. It also means thoughts worthy of further consideration of a nervously ill person. Jung first recognized the book, its interest, and recommended it to Freud. And then Freud wrote the reading that was for the longest time, the only psychoanalytic theorization of psychosis, based on the book. To jump forward a little bit to the very end of the excerpt I assigned for now, there is this fabulous moment when Freud postulates the endopsychic perception. This happens in other case studies as well. If you take them all together, you can notice that the endopsychic perception, which is a kind of inside view of the functioning of the psychic apparatus or of the psyche, that is included within the psychic disturbance or the delusional system. And he assigns endopsychic perception always to delusional systems that alternate between sort of archaeological funereal moments and technological moments of persecution. So between these two, or the alternation between the two, constitute a kind of endopsychic perception. And at the end of the excerpt I gave you, he suddenly says, I could call on witnesses to prove that I developed my theory of libido before reading this text. And it's this wonderfully paranoid moment when Freud isn't only talking about how the psychotic delusion gives you plain text on psychic reality itself, which brings back the same notion that psychotics are often closer to the control panel of psychic reality, or even reality. But he says that even his theory about all of this is somehow duplicated in the language of Schreber's delusional system. Okay, let's close that digression. Schreber, as you know, this is your point of access to the case, along lines that that were drawn in the names of Lacan and Foucault. I don't know if they necessarily went there with this case. But right before the psychotic breakdown, he was appointed Chief Justice?
Judge of Judges.
Judge of Judges. Oh, yeah.
But the idea is that he could not really go any higher. He spent his whole life moving up the ladder, and this to Lacan represents a kind of impossibility of integrating his symbolic identity back into the real. So it ended up a kind of implosion, as it were.
Perhaps even more to the point is what Lacan does mention in his reading of the Schreber case, and that is that a funny detail, it's not really Lacan's style, but he says that Schreber was visiting with his mother right before the psychotic crack-up. But anyway, Schreber was part of an illustrious family. His father was a Moritz Schreber, but anyway, also Schreber, was a famous physician who published widely, almost as a kind of ideologue, promoting preventive gymnastics and health care for children, but also for the wider populace, to promote well-being. More those who would take a more biographical approach, maybe even more than I, point out that if you look at the drawings for the different correctives for poor posture and stuff that he promoted in his books, one can see, not between the lines, but one can see also corrections for childhood masturbation. So basically he came up with harnesses that allowed for better posture but also censored the body. And as one can imagine, there was really no exception in this case, anyone who conducted experiments at that time conducted them always first upon one's own family. So the sons were probably strapped into these harnesses. Various critics have suggested, and they're right up to a certain point, that within the various technical contraptions that confine and control Schreber and his delusional system are also souvenirs of the father's management of their bodies. Freud doesn't know about any of this because he says, wow, Schreber was Schreber's father, a famous doctor, probably a benign god for him. And to this day, those little gardens that you find in Germany along the train tracks often, where city dwellers are encouraged, have been encouraged since the 19th century to go spend some time in the open air and tend a garden or something. This was a kind of health recommendation that he made, and they're known as Schreber gardens. That much said, Schreber underwent his second crisis. The first was sort of hypochondriacal anxiety disorder that Dr. Flexik was able to contain or heal. And from that day onward, Flexik's photograph or portrait was prominently displayed on his wife's writing table as the savior of their marriage and her husband's health. But he, at that time, as you mentioned, when he was made the judge of judges, he underwent a second and decisive psychotic breakdown. Now, in the memoirs, it's hard to reconstruct the linearity of the disease. One would have to warn against even trying to do that. But of course, as Freud points out, much of the contours, many of the contours of the delusional system were introduced after the fact. First, there was the crisis. One thing that's always referred to in the memoirs is the Brüllenwunder. There were moments and continue to be moments when he just starts screaming for extended periods of time. These are out times by the time we're visiting him in his delusional system, but one gets the sense there of what the actual moment of breakdown might have been like, the moment of hospitalization. In any event, what emerges from this breakdown is the delusional system that I've only touched on briefly as containing technological and funereal archaeological coordinates within a new world order that extends all the way to outer space. There's literal science fiction going on in the delusional system. But as important is the way in which he goes about trying to understand how it was that he lost the former world. This is what Freud is addressing in the excerpt I recommended for now. The way in which he tries to understand how he lost his world and how this new world order came to be and how it is held together around him, around his crisis. So he develops a world system that includes a kind of religious system, which is at the same time remarkably secular. But in his notion of the relationship between humanity and not just God, but there are at least two gods, he says that, he speaks about them one at a time, however. God consists of nerves. This nerve power often takes the form of rays, Strahlen, which is how God communicates and also controls or communicates the intake and outtake of this nervous energy. And human beings, too, are his creations to the extent that they consist entirely of nerves or rays. And God has no relationship with living human beings, but only recognizes dead human beings. This is Schreber's main reproach to God, that he takes cognizance only of corpses. He doesn't interest himself for living beings. So at one point, Schreber was depressed. Let's say he was playing dead, melancholically, and God mistook that state as death. And so he started harvesting Schreber's nerves, but then found out that Schreber was still alive. And so God and Schreber could not be separated. This is the crisis and the organizing condition of the New World Order. There are many more details, and I'm not going to go into the details, but the crux is that by that accident, a merger with a living human being took place, which upset the order of the world, went against the order of the world. It holds up the ability of souls to enter the various levels of the afterlife, or the various stages of metabolization in the afterlife. And it also puts the future itself in jeopardy. The future, literally, as the continued existence of living humanity. So the crisis is how will humankind continue? The world has ended. The new world at this crisis point, as I just now described it. And so, through the rays of God, Schreber must become a kind of android, in other words, a woman and a robot, this new kind of creation in the place of woman, who will not reproduce the future of mankind, but will, through this replicating power of the rays and the nerves, introduce a mutation in the living all of humanity. So this is the basic science fiction of Schreber's delusional system. And like Metropolis or Future Eve, the French text, Schreber, as the survivor, as the guarantor of survival, assumes a position at once of woman and of robot. He assumes a position of technologizable woman, so as to secure a future for the species.
Tangential question.
Sure.
My chronology is a little frayed, but do you know if Bataille ever took this up explicitly in regards to the solar economy?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's what it is going on.
No, it really is. I don't know why they just don't teach it in high school. I mean, it's really the master text of a lot of modern traditions of thinking, rethinking. So, for our purposes today, I wanted to look a little bit at certain moments in his encounter with Schreber's memoirs, his formulation of projection, and, as I mentioned before, how he goes about addressing what is so crucial to Schreber in his memoirs, this notion of the end of the world. The end of the world is, of course, a recurring feature in psychotic delusional systems, like the influence of machine I referred to before. So there's something at stake. I'm trying to come up with a reading of what that endopsychically, as it were, reflects.
I have a quick remark, actually, in response to your question. It made me think of a wonderful film that takes up a lot of these issues in regards to lesbianism and female bodies called Technolust. It's really incredible. It's like the campiest, most insane thing that happens where these cybernetic women are sperm stealers to create a lesbian robot race. And, it's starring the director Derek Jarman's muse. What was her name? Say again? That's right.
Really? And it's
Yeah.
Sterling, she plays the same.
And yeah, she's tri-vected. And it's,
Four, I think.
oh yeah, I haven't seen it in a long time, but it's.
Tilda Swinton is wonderful.
Is the typical reading of his concept of soul murder transference? Is that kind of the idea? The idea of human beings that inflict violence or pain on others through nerve connections, I think, or something like this?
Yeah, good. As you know, soul murder is the big question mark in the book, because that's where his family decided to intervene, and a whole section that would have illustrated soul murder with examples from the family was removed. The only example that survived is a more literary one. It says it's like the Faustian Pact, whereby one being tries to live on through another being, which is an odd way to identify the Faustian Pact, just the same. Yes, you're right. It's a dramatic feature of this network of rays and others. So, what's important in Freud's reading at this time is that he speaks of the delusional system as the moment of recovery. No one had done that before. It's so important for us to keep in mind what that means. Other psychiatrists or analysts like Jung or Binswanger would instead say that wherever this convergence of archaeological and technological features can be found, that something like chronic schizophrenia has set in, that we've reached the point of untreatability. But Freud argued that this is where the possibility of stabilization is secured. It becomes possible for Schreber, through his delusional system, as a system, to recover himself and his world. It's not the world he lost, but it's a world of relations. And finally, he's able to resecure his rights and return to the world, as it were, as soon as he's able to renew diplomatic relations with the other reality. So whereas before, as he points out, whereas before he saw all other beings he encountered as replicants, as miraculated up beings, as non-existent. He alone survived the end of the world. He now sees that they exist. He can accept their existence, but realizes that they don't subscribe, and realizes that they don't subscribe to his view. Once that has happened, he is stable. He is able to go to court and get his rights back. He returns to his wife, and for 12 years, which is a long period, 11 or 12 years, remains stable, which Benjamin refers to as the encapsulation of his illness. That's what intrigued him so much about the memoirs, is this encapsulation of the madness systematically alongside other realities. Like an alternate reality, I guess. It's this content of grief and suffering. At the end, however, the robot is destroyed in an accident, and Lord Avard, this person who was being helped out, finally commits suicide, as though again, as in the Faustian, as in Faust by Goethe, the whole period of striving toward an alternative to the fateful depression only takes the form of the deferral of the suicide itself. Anyway, I mentioned that because the robot woman created in Metropolis is also shadowed by a certain content, and we wouldn't be reading the figure fully if we didn't take cognizance of that. That's what I'll be focusing on, the place of the robot woman in Metropolis. That place is identified in the first scene, and we'll skip to a later scene in which she's created and introduced into the society of Metropolis. I'll take it from there. Do you remember the numbers?
Is 6 and 11?
I think so, yeah. Yep. The graining moments were, of course, stills or pieces of film that had been recently found. This film was lost to its American version. Only the American version existed for the longest time. It got cut from 4 hours roughly to 2, roughly. And the person in charge of editing the film down to a more acceptable length decided to get rid of the story of Hale because it would sound too much like hell to American audiences, and so So that's wonderful, because she was missing for ages and then returned in the course of the reconstruction of the film, thus enacting her significance, because she is the submerged loss in the film, of course, that all the activities in the other activities in the film refer to in one form or another. Rotwang, the mad scientist, has been commissioned to come up with a series of robots according to the original plan that would create a new working class machines. So it's not something the film creates, except he is staged as insane with grief or insane. So it's his own little joke, as it were, that the skeletal substructure of the future end machines should suggest a female. Because he is quite clear from the start that he is rebuilding Hale. The complicated story, which is delivered with the bust in that one scene, flies by so quickly perhaps, but I hope it's clear that he loses her first to her marriage to the other one. So he loses really edibly this odd man out, but then Hale also dies in childbirth in that other marriage. So the first thing he does is he gives his hand, the hand that wasn't taken in marriage, to the construction of Hale, and that's the bond that then is reduplicated throughout the film in a sense, the underworld bond, the mechanical hand, which is his vital connection, as it were, with the robot. So the Maria story enters into all of this. The son, Freda, has already fallen for her. She is a maternal figure. That's quite clear. When she first comes up to him in the pleasure garden reserved for the children of the ruling class, she speaks of the worker children that she's brought with her as her siblings, thereby putting herself in the mother position. And he's instantly taken by her into the underworld that he had never seen before, an underworld which is at the same time, of course, machinic. In that opening sequence, he hallucinates then the machine that the workers are stoking or whatever as the god Moloch that devours children. So that's the first break. The final break, of course, we saw at the very end of the second clip. So it turns out that she is a woman with a message. The workers are following that message, which is considered too counterculture by the ruler. And so he decides that, as though by accident, that the blank, as it were, should become Maria. All we know is that at the end of the film, when Rotwang completely loses it, he sees the real Maria as Hale. So I don't want to get lost in the possibility of resemblances, but she is available for projection upon her of this missing woman. All the Oedipal and Christian themes notwithstanding, they are carried forward up to a certain point. Freda is accepted by Maria as the mediator she's looking for. She argues that there is a terrible schism between the brain and the hands, in other words, the ruling class and the workers. Something has to be inserted between them as mediation, as mediator. And Schreber is nominated by her for that role. And in the end, in the very strange and strained happy ending, where after the robot woman is torched, and Maria, of course, survives, there's a performance of that ceremony supervised by Maria, whereby Schreber is put into the position of mediator. The problem is, of course, that underneath the discourse of the missing mediator, there's something else missing that the film keeps on insisting upon. The woman, the womb, something in between brain and hands, at some midpoint, is missing and continually being reanimated throughout the course of the film. So that the film can't get around its crypt message, in spite of all the intentions to come up with a Christian and Oedipal reading. By Oedipal, I simply mean that the problem he has with Maria as a maternal figure, a mother figure, is worked through in the course of her being doubled and divided between the good Maria and the robot Maria, who's of course bad and lascivious and a troublemaker and threatening. So that the split is carried forward all the way to the point of her torching is what then liberates Schreber for the Oedipal solution and the marriage. But again, I think what inserts itself in the midst of all of that, like the prosthetic hand of Holtwang, is another kind of missingness in the equation that's supposed to get us through the happy ending. And if you were to look at the film as a whole, you would be impressed by how this whole future world to which we are introduced, a world of work, of future productivity, nothing really seems to be made, at least in any kind of diversity or infrastructural sense. Everyone is simply enslaved to the only project that counts, keeping Metropolis alive, animated, both the city it's built upon, but also the film. The film becomes the outer walls of the crypt, in some sense. So, what interests me again about this, and why I wanted to see it in juxtaposition with the Schreber case, is the way in which a certain legibility, certainly, is brought into this deeply regressed, I don't mean that in a negative sense, but a film that is really just barely making it, if you think about it. It's a brilliant film, but it consists only of the desire to live on, to remain animate in some sense. It's a thin proposition and production schedule. But it is nevertheless held together by this encryptment of Hale, I would argue. I mean, the film is a stabilized, delusional system that has a certain kind of legibility owing to the encryptment of this figure, Hale. Also, the insistence with which we have to begin with the woman's body in the course of projecting the science fiction of technological bodies is what interests me. Of course, we've already talked about that in the case of Schreber, I guess. Here, within Metropolis, we belong to a finite but long line of rehearsals and repetitions in science fiction, where the focus is on, again, the woman when it comes to technologization. Bringing it up to that point, I wonder if there's discussion around that issue. Any questions? Why? Answers why? Why is it the woman's body is technologized first? Yes?
Well, I'm curious sort of what you mean by first. I mean, in this film, sure, it's he makes the sort of man looking like the woman, but I'm thinking here about Frankenstein, which of course is the male scientist makes a male monster. Of course, the story is written by a woman, and it has all this sort of connection to giving birth and childhood and stuff, but it's still this male construction. So.
Yeah, I know that this is unfair because it's roundabout, but he builds that monster in place of mourning his mother. I mean, I really think the monster is his mother.
Okay, I think the monster is his child.
Well, but if you look at the narrative, I mean, the series of 2-year periods that lead to the building of the monster in the alma mater follows from that moment when the mother dies, and he doubles that departure by departing for Ingolstadt. That's why he can't make a recognizably female monster when the monster asks for a mate, because in getting that close to the mother, he would inadvertently have to acknowledge her as the object of all this activity. Now, all of this isn't fair. I could also just say that Frankenstein isn't technically a robot. But in all the stories of robots that I know of, leading up to a certain point, I'm sure it gets diversified eventually, it's a woman who's first presented as a robot.
Okay.
So, but if you give it, but whether I'm right or wrong doesn't really matter. Why would there be any interest at all in technologizing of the woman? Certainly she's the first one technologizing Metropolis, so just stick to that. Why technologize her?
I think this is a super current concern that has to do with IUD development and the notion of a desire in some individuals to completely repress the periodization process in female bodies, which is to say, Heidegger used to speak a lot about the horizon of our knowledge being bound by our understanding of mortality, to which his liaison, Arendt, would continually invoke the horizon of our knowledge being inscribed within our potential for natality. And so there's a real question of the complicitousness between time and birth that I think has to do with this narrative thread, this kind of red thread. And I think that, we begin to see, like, if natality, so if the process of giving birth is always temporal, as mortality would also be inscribed within different modes of temporality. I think what's really important is the clock, in a way. A contemporary poet, Eleni Sikelianos, who teaches at the University of Denver, refers to it as the body clock, and has a wonderful book tracing kind of the genealogies of the time of birthing, and why that time would be a time that different powers would be want to tamper with and use for whatever ends they could envision. I mean, this is like an open question.
Everything you say makes sense to me, but rather than think of the technologization of woman as the repression of all of that, I would then rather say that this isn't what I had in mind, but her technologization literally follows from that. I mean, my sense of periodicity is that that's already an occult, seemingly technical way in which women are able to, shall I say, realign schedules. I mean, when I was working on the adolescents in the case of California, I read all kinds of stuff about women when they were in a sorority house together were able to realign their periods and stuff like that. It becomes the clock with the scheduling. It's continuous with all of that. But I did not necessarily want to go there. I'm just saying that that could be received as a kind of proto-technology.
I think we're thinking along the same lines, but I was thinking of it simply because just as a site of reproduction, and I think it's interesting what you say, rather than as a way of wanting to corrupt that, more it may be more about the valorization of that, to really ameliorate that as opposed to squash it. And it seems to me that site of reproduction would be one of the most potent things to want to tamper with, and that's why it would be winning first technology.
So what would reproduction have to do with the relationship to Hale? I mean, she died in childbirth, of course, but all of this is in relation to a lost woman. How does reproduction figure in that scenario, do you think?
Well, I'm thinking of reproduction, that's what the woman represents. Purely, that's what the woman represents in this context or any context. Pared down, that's what she is.
You're absolutely right. I'm just thinking in terms of a mourning or unmourning scenario, that the ability to reproduce represents not only what I talked about earlier, the conjunction of reproduction and death as something that replication seeks to circumvent or overcome, but also reproduction is the site for a conceivable substitution. This is something that comes up for mothers like Mary Shelley, who are comforted sometimes after the loss of a child. Well, there can be another one. And I would argue, at least if melancholia shadows the decision of the sensibility, that the mother would be the last person who would want to use reproduction to replace the lost child. So I think it's part of the melancholia of the film, not only that reproduction as such, for the reasons I've given earlier, would be replaced or augmented, controlled, what have you, via replication, but also that outlet for substitution be shut down.
For some reason, John Travolta is coming to me.
Oh, why did they reproduce it?
Yeah, because they lost their
Guess
son.
it's
And
better to
I mean, it
see.
was so public that they,
She's like 47 or 48, and they made it was so fast after the loss of their son that they, it was so public, and then she had the new baby, and they had lost this other baby that just seems so manufactured or something. Like, it was really terrifying.
Yeah, well, that's something that is often inconceivable. But you say, to you, it's almost like another Metropolis.
Yeah, that's what,
Because of the conditions. I know of scenarios where a mother would have another child very quickly so that a marrow transplant becomes possible to save an older child or that sort of thing. But simply to put reproduction at the disposal of substitution, which is a societal demand, is something that I think women or mothers in the first place have problems with. I should add, by the way, that this is not solely a fiction solely conceived by Fritz Lang, but in the first place by his wife at the time, Thea von Harburg. She wrote it up as a screenplay and as a novel, which is also the case with Woman in the Moon, that will be considered. She's very much in control of much of this film. Lang, who later disowned her in many ways and blamed the ending of the film on her, said that all he was interested in at the time was machines. He was a gadget lover, and that's what he contributed to the film. But if you look at the narratives, you can see her strong influence in much of the films. I mean, just for the sake of throwing that into the speculation.
I have a question about the language.
Yeah.
I was wondering if in the German version the word Mensch or Mann is used. Which one is used for the machines?
Mensch.
So human, not
Right.
necessarily a sign of gender.
Right, but then when synonyms are used, I can't remember now about the film, but in the narrative, yeah, so it is gender. What also interests me about the film, or the set, as one might imagine, what things were like on the set at the time. Rotwang is played by Thea von Harburg's ex-husband. So she's, I won't be going there right now, but a lot of this is her fantasy, so something that she's working with.